No one better to tell us what we will do about overdiagnosis than our first speaker, Peter Gøtzsche Sobre. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration in 1993, which may end up being his most important legacy, but I know he's got a lot of fight left in him, and we can only stand back in awe as he tells us what we will do about overdiagnosis. Peter.
I write that drugs are the third leading cause of death in the Western world after heart disease and cancer. And partly and mostly because the business model of the drug industry is organized crime. But they steal far more money and kill far more people than the mob can ever do. So we need to do something. We need to demedicalize our societies.
So Peter is one of the people in the world who actually looks at the data beyond the biases, beyond the pharmaceutical industry, to see what it really says about whether treatments work or not. And he's also got the courage to speak out and say the things that need to be said.
To reach the threshold for evidence of effectiveness, you have to meet the threshold for good study criteria. And I think every scientist on the planet would agree that the thresholds set by the Cochrane Foundations are very high thresholds, that they're scientifically sound.
It grew out of frustration among some researchers that we cannot trust the published literature. It is flawed and some of it is fraudulent. And 3 years before we started the Cochrane collaboration, I had defended my thesis in Copenhagen, where I had reviewed arthritis drugs, painkillers, and came to the conclusion that the clinical trials that were being done with these drugs were pretty unreliable. So we wanted to do better and to find the biases in these trials and come closer to the truth than what the drug industry wanted us to come to. We developed methods for aggregating results from several trials and how to scrutinize these trials in great detail to find flaws in them that are not obvious at a quick reading. So it demands some kind of detective work, just like as in police work. Through litigation, we got unpublished data. It's very sad when you use such a fantastic instrument as the randomized trial is and abuse it for monetary gains. But when the drug industry cheats with its data, it can sometimes kill tens of thousands of patients. So it's far worse. And yet we have a system where drug regulators rely on what the industry tells them. And if the industry manipulates the evidence, they can often earn billions of dollars compared to if they were honest. What I have seen in psychiatry is worse than what I have seen anywhere else. It's just incredible the extent to which the drug industry has cheated with its trials and how it has withheld even lethal harms, suicides, from public view. I investigated the 10 biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world and found out that their business model fulfilled the criteria for organized crime according to US law. And organized crime is very serious. It can be fraud, bribery in form of kickbacks, other types of corruption, and it involves that you do the same type of crimes repeatedly, even when you are told not to, and even when you agree with the US Department of Justice, and you sign an agreement never to do it again, then the companies do it again and again because crime pays. The fines they get for the crimes are a tiny fraction of what they earn by the crimes. So you can't expect them to stop being criminals. Antipsychotics are extremely dangerous drugs. And Zyprexa, for example, is so popular and used so much that I have estimated that With that drug, Eli Lilly has killed around 200,000 people. So these death tolls are just enormous, and tells us that we need to be much, much more conservative with drugs than we are currently.
To me, Peter is one of my medical heroes. To be sitting, debating at the same table as him is a bit like somebody who likes football, playing at a match with Ronaldinho or Pelé, because he's, I think, one of the top figures in the whole world at the moment.
The problems that my research is pointing to in New Zealand are occurring elsewhere in the world. So we see that a marketing model has been applied to the promotion of psychiatric medications, and I'm not convinced that that has been necessarily for the public good.
Prescription drugs had been a new epidemic. People would have done a lot to conquer that epidemic, even if the number of deaths had only been a tiny fraction of the number of deaths that drugs cause. And yet, somehow, because it's drugs, people do absolutely nothing. So I want to tell people with my book that drugs are so dangerous that doctors cannot handle them safely, and our authorities, the FDA, cannot guarantee the safety we need in order to take drugs, because otherwise it wouldn't be the third leading cause of death. That's pretty obvious. I call psychiatry the drug industry's paradise because it's so easy to manipulate just about everything. The way you come up with a diagnosis is easy to manipulate. So if we are not cautious, we will all end up being psychiatric patients if we don't fight against this. I don't know why people can kill so many patients in psychiatry and nobody does anything. But what is so tragic about these drugs is that they can have an effect in some patients in the short term. But if you continue using them, they actually create psychiatric diseases, which is a disaster. And my conclusion is that the doctors cannot handle this duality, that they can be beneficial in the short term, but they are harmful in the long term. They cannot handle it. Many doctors just go on for months and years and harm their patients in this way. It's terribly sad that the psychiatrists at large cannot see how much harm they are causing. So after having studied this in some detail, I conclude in my book that it would be better for mankind if none of these drugs existed.
My perspective on this is that I'm a family doctor, so I sit in the consulting room with the people who are really the end users of evidence and research, and also the people who are harmed by overdiagnosis and overtreatment. So I see the real effects in people's day-to-day lives. What I'm interested in is what mechanisms that we have to interrupt this flow, to restore a balance of what medical care should really offer, which is not just about medicines, it's about listening to the patient and what their problems are and being able to empathise enough to understand what they are. And then about drawing on what the best that medical science has to offer, which is where Peter and his group, people like him, come in, which is people who have a real ability to look at the data truthfully.
What do you do with a specialty that to some extent live on a lie? How do you deal with that? I have heard so many psychiatrists, also professors, say that starting an antidepressant is like giving insulin to a diabetic, which is completely wrong, and yet they still say this nonsense. what they mean is that these patients lack serotonin in their brain. So when they give a drug that increases serotonin, it should be good. But it's wrong. The hypothesis about serotonin is stone dead. The good studies that have been made could not see that depressed patients were different from normal patients. What these drugs do is they do not correct a chemical imbalance. That's another lie psychiatrists love, that you have a chemical imbalance like a diabetic that lacks insulin, so now we're going to correct your chemical imbalance. It's a lie. They are creating a chemical imbalance, and it's exactly for this reason that it's difficult for patients to stop after 2 or 3 months, because there is now an imbalance. And you know, there are even drugs that decrease serotonin that have an effect on depression. How can you say that you lack serotonin, so you need to increase serotonin, and then at the same time have drugs that are also effective that decrease serotonin? I mean, a diabetic doesn't get better if you give that person sugar.
So what's the missing link between having the evidence, and this applies across medicine, because it's really easy for us to start drugs, so easy for me to write a prescription. What are the barriers to not doing things? And one of the growth drivers for this explosion of SSRI prescription is the fact that people go on and they stay on them. Part of that is the withdrawal effects that people have coming off, but the other part is this. There are consensus guidelines that suggest that if you've had more than a couple of dark pools in your life, that maybe you need to stay on these drugs for life. But in fact, there is absolutely no data to suggest that this is helpful.
Psychiatry has gone the wrong way. Whittaker has described this beautifully in his book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, that if it were really true that psychiatric drugs helped correct some kind of imbalance in the brain, then we would expect people who receive pension and who cannot work to go down. And what have we seen? The opposite. The number of these people have exploded at the same time as we introduce these drugs. I mean, how can people not see this? We are doing more or less exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. These drugs are dangerous. They should be given in as short periods as possible and then stop. And very many patients shouldn't get them at all. Most depressed patients recover by themselves. So why not wait and see some weeks? Then many of them would never get an antidepressant, and then they would have no problem stopping the drug. What the psychiatrists then say is, I have heard that often, well, on the other hand, it's important to give these drugs because they reduce the risk of suicide. As far as I can see, this has never been documented. Quite the contrary, we know that these drugs increase the risk of suicide in young people up to the age of 40, according to FDA data, and we don't really know what they do above the age of 40 because the drug companies have cheated so enormously in their randomized trials. So in the worst case, these drugs might increase the risk of suicide in all age groups. When you discover that the business model is organized crime, and when you find out that it's far worse than mob crime, because the drug industry steals much more money from the public purse than the mafia can ever do, and they kill far, far more.